Hello, and welcome to the South Coast Artist Index, where artists, performers, and writers, as well as curators, directors, and supporters, anyone with ties to the creative community, drops by to introduce themselves to you. We'll talk about their beginnings, their vision, their passion, and so much more. The South Coast Artist Index podcast is brought to you in part by Heavenly Spirits, who invites you to celebrate the art of life and creative communities everywhere.
Hi, this is Ron Fortier with another episode of the In Focus podcast brought to you by the Artists Index. And I believe that this next guest, who will introduce himself shortly, is perhaps the first, and I don't know the terminology, and I'll have to ask. So I'm going to leave you hanging on that, and I'm going to ask our guest to please state your name and spell your name and introduce yourself.
Hello, Ron. My name is Seth Rainville, Sethrainv, as in Victor, ILLE. As my mom always said, it's a four-letter word you can scream in public.
Oh, yeah. So the conundrum I had is, what do you prefer to have your vocation labeled as? Ceramicist, potter? Are there other new terms now? Because, you know, they're always coming up with something.
It's an interesting one and has been for going on, well, let's see, it's been 30 years that I've been in ceramics as of this year. And people like to tell me that I'm an artist, because every time I try to say that I'm a potter, which I always consider myself to be, they're like, oh, no, you're an artist. And I always venture, the question as to why. And of course, it's because I draw on pots. And so I guess ceramic artist seems to be the easiest title. It seems to be what you read on, name placards, that kind of thing, in museums and whatnot, that kind of thing. So doesn't really matter to me. I think in the pottery world, as wonderful and magnificent as it can be, we just throw out the term potter all the time, regardless of what, even if you're a sculptor that works in clay. No pun intended.
The pun intended is the throwing, because that's what potters do. They throw clay on the wheel. But when you say I'm a potter, and then people, because we live in New England near Boston, it's like, a potter what?
Yeah. Exactly.
Anyway,
exactly.
But this is also an interesting category, an interesting genre, because there's another split there. Well, let me go back to when you say ceramics, they're like, oh yeah, my grandmother used to do that at St. Anthony's basement.
Yeah.
No, this is different. And then there's that other fork in the road, artisan, artist. And that's still something, Groucho Marx had his own little take on that. And he used to say the difference between a vase and a vase being, I guess, an ordinary item, versus a vase, which would be a very nice vase, expensive one. He says, a vase costs $3, a vase costs $30. Something to that effect. So
exactly.
When we look at this, are you sometimes, and that's another thing, who says you can't live in both worlds? Are you sometimes an artisan and sometimes an artist, or do you really care?
It's really interesting, because I came into ceramics kind of by accident, because I wanted to be the next great painter. And took private painting, oil painting classes since I was about 8 years old in my hometown, as a way of keeping me off the streets, etc. And so when I ran into clay, it was in the artisanry department of UMass Dartmouth, right? So I'm like, what is artisanry? And then I found out that term was made up by the people that brought BU into UMass Dartmouth and that Swain School and all of that. And I'm like, well, it sounds like a real term. And to anyone that's been to UMass Dartmouth, it's not only a real term to us, but it's a revered term that has been recently dropped and drives me nuts still. But So when you hear the word artisan in the South Coast, it carries weight. That when I say those same words elsewhere, I lived in Arizona for 10 years, and I tell people I graduated from UMass Dartmouth in the artisanry program, and they're like, what did you just say? Like, and did you pronounce an R where you didn't mean to? And it's like, well, probably, but so the idea of making something by hand makes you a craftsman, right? Because it's a craft, it's a skill that I can teach anyone. And when I mean anyone, I've had some doozies, people with missing limbs, or people with massive brain injuries, or people with mental issues that take my class and expect that, it's going to solve their problems. And they realize, well, this is harder than it looks. I'm like, well, yes, but I can still teach you how to do this because it's physics. But it's this idea that the handmade object, to me, is just a blank canvas to express myself in a way that a flat surface wasn't ever giving me. I always wanted more. I always wanted there to be some dimensionality to my work, and not just in the way that I was shading something or layering paint on top of paint and waiting 48 hours to sand it back and then paint again. So for me, this idea of a development of telling a story in 3 dimensions, or working around an object, the top of it, the bottom of it, the interior of it, these are things that I obsess about in my work. It might not be where the art part of it comes from the same place when I was a painter, meaning I get inspired by music or a poem or writing or seeing something in a museum, whatever it may be. An idea pops, something going on in the world, something I saw on the news or listened to on a podcast or whatever else. Those things breed a narrative or an idea or a visual that then I have to reflect on that idea and say, how can I best create a 3-dimensional canvas to encapsulate that idea? So yeah, I'm an artisan. There's artisanry.
Yeah, I mean, well, and the other thing that pops into mind too is I don't know, we love to splinter things up. I mean, and so there's the whole artisanry department, which I'll get back to that thought before I forget this one. The difference could be argued between art and artisanry, or artist and artisan, is utility. If you create art because it really has only an aesthetic utility, in other words, yeah. And then the other one is, okay, you stick some flowers in it, now it has utility. So, and even again, you've seen Antique Roadshow. I mean, sure. Somebody's got what was it, that Ming bowl or jade bowl from some dynasty,
$1 million from a yard sale.
Yeah, they were like, keeping using it for popcorn. I mean,
right.
All of a sudden they went from utilitarian to, oh my God,
Right. Sure.
And then back to artisanry, because when I was at what was then Southeastern Massachusetts University, which became, it must have been during your tenure there, where it when Swain came in.
My first year, it's the first year they so I have my SMU sweatshirt and my UMass Dartmouth sweatshirt bought in the same year.
Yeah, exactly. They had the ceramics department, which was on the ground floor, which was almost that pit, and what we used to call Group 1, which they call LARTS now for liberal arts.
Right.
And there was a Roku kiln, which is basically a bonfire. For all I know of Roku, I think
you just made a digital streaming receptor into a 1,000-year-old process of firing from Japan.
Yeah.
Raku.
Roku.
You stream your Netflix on Raku.
Okay. I'm glad I didn't say ragu.
Yeah,
that's a nicer sauce. But anyway, so they just refer to that as the ceramics department, but there was no great dissertations about this, that, or the other. But now you bring in the artisanry department, and if you got they had a fiber and textiles department, which they were fiber artists. Now you have fiber artisans. So you've got a weaver that makes things to hang on the walls for everybody to go, ooh, isn't that lovely? And then you have a weaver that actually makes it goes on. Now,
Sure.
One of the things that I really enjoyed about your work, and the Wise Guys exhibit, especially, was, so you're using ceramic or pottery as your canvas.
Mm-hmm.
And boy, you have, and this was kind of the lead up to all this about utilitarian and, and so on and so forth. You're not just painting. I mean, I can imagine somebody out there listening going, well, people paint flowers and animals on, what's the big deal? Well, you look like your work looks like tattoos. That it's like a cross between tattoo and scrimshaw. Am I even close in that kind of vibe that I'm getting from the work?
Well, it's funny because the second I moved to Arizona, everyone got away from the scrimshaw concept because that's not relevant to the culture out there. Mm-hmm. So I got, you must really look at cave paintings from Tlaquepaque and all these, and I'm like, yes, as well, and probably more so than I ever have scrimshaw. But I also grew up with scrimshaw everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. So there's no way it couldn't have been part of that subconscious. But I think the thing about scrimshaw that was always more interesting to me, and coming back, going to the Whaling Museum, looking at that amazing collection there, I started to realize it wasn't the scrimshaw that was inspiring to me. It was the stories behind the men and women that created it. And the stories being told on these teeth, on these amazing bones, and that's the stuff that blew me away. It's like you're reading some of the backstories of, their ship went down and we recovered this. And it's like, well, is this documenting their last hours on Earth, or, it's half done at the bottom? Like, that was always the stuff that intrigued me the most. Mm-hmm. So you were the first one in terms of someone that had reviewed a show of mine over 24 or 5 years of exhibiting across the country, to write a review using the word tattoo. And I remember reading that review and I wanted to high five you in space because
I thought you were going to say smack me.
No. It was great because I think I've always struggled to find a singular way to, I had a class in Arizona of blind students. School for the Blind sent a class over to learn throwing. And I thought that was going to be an incredibly challenging thing. It became incredibly easy to teach them how to make stuff because it's all about feel. And you have to trust your sense of touch. So they learned very, very quickly how to make pots, but try to describe to them how to glaze something. It's like, well, what does this glaze look like? And I'm like, well, it looks like cinnamon. Oh, cool. I love the smell of cinnamon. So now when I use this bowl, I'm going to smell cinnamon. I'm like, cool. Well, that's not something I thought of. Yeah. So for me, the idea of having to label my work was always a little hard. So when you tattoo yourself, you're making a statement. The Native American culture tattooed themselves to make very clear statements about birthright or, war practices or whatever it may be. And my study of a lot of Native American culture in college and beyond made me fall in love with that idea, of the broken circle and all these kind of amazing things that are basically creating framework or canvas on a limb, or your face or it's like we look at all of these R&B singers that have all these incredible face tattoos, and they're singing these love ballads from the depths of their soul. And I'm like, this is what my work is. This is beautiful. But 20 years ago, that guy would have been like, oh man, he must have been in jail. So it's just, we as a culture have grown to look at fashion and the skin that we're all in. And I think I've always tried to think of my work that way. And put myself out there. But as I get older, I realize more and more that the gift I can give people is to express myself about my life on my work. Everything I do is autobiographical to some degree, and let people vibe on it for themselves and bring their own story to it. So I'm trying not to beat people over the head with, here's my statement, it's only about this. Even early in my career, I didn't necessarily try to do that. I just had something to say, and there was imagery in my head that needed to get out. And that's kind of where it came from. But that idea, you really nailed it with the term tattoo when you were describing my work. And I really did appreciate that review. It was a beautifully written piece. Because that is, even the tattoo sleeve vases that I'm making now are directly related to that comment that you made.
Yeah, the other thing too is, I mean, there's a lot of juxtaposition. You have a hard object, clay. You go through a lot of trouble taking a soft, malleable substance, shaping it, firing it until it's hard. Okay, and then you go and put those glazes on that have this very pale. I mean, it's almost like someone who's lived in a cave and hasn't seen sunlight. And I don't mean this in a disparaging way, but I mean, I'm
Sure.
explaining, what I say. And then you've got that exquisite drawing, it looks like tattoo-like on there as well. And so now I see the softness of skin from this hard surface, but I also now am juxtaposing, because there was a couple of pieces that you did where the vessel, the vessel that you created had these aspirations, or these you're gonna have to refresh my memory on that in a bit, but just my thought was, okay, well, you have a tattooed body that holds these things inside, so the body is also a vessel,
Correct.
Thoughts, the feelings, and so on and so forth. And I thought that's absolutely amazing, because I mean, I've seen a lot of pottery, everything from the scary face Appalachian type all the way on down. And I've also seen, if I remember their names correctly, and correct me because you were out there, Grace Medicine Flower, Joseph Lone Wolf was her brother, and then my friend Peter at University of Miami was a collector of Southwest art and artifacts.
Sure.
And he was very well studied in it. And Black Maria, he actually had maybe two pieces of Black Maria pottery, which a lot of people would sneak into your house at night and steal from you if they knew you had it.
Yeah, Maria Martinez, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So there's this whole incredible culture from, and the shifting sands of parlance. At one time we called them indigenous people. Of course, they're indigenous to the United States, but now there's a preference for the First Nation people. And even with cultures where there is, the pots and the baskets and the weaving, all the stuff from the Honors program, even though there's this high utilitarian, I don't even want to say value, usage.
Sure.
There's also stuff that they made just for the sheer joy of looking at it.
Yeah.
And it brings me to they were these street kids. I forgot what city it was in. I think it may have been in Rio de Janeiro a couple of years back, actually almost a decade now. And they found these, they used to call them street waifs. And as abject as was the poverty and the horribleness of their existence, most of those kids that they pulled off the street had a little tin or a little bag or a little box or something they carried with them constantly, that they put in broken pieces of colored glass that was, unusual, like a blue that you can't find, or little beads, or little. And so basically these kids have been brought down to almost a primitive level, but there's got to be something intrinsic in humanity to see more than what you're looking at. And I see that in your work.
Yeah. I think maybe that's where ceramics was my destination in my creative life. even though it was not on the radar because my high school was so incredibly poor at the time that we barely had manila paper and pencils for the art program. So I never had ceramics. So it's not like I was going to leap into paying all that money for school and trying something I've never tried before. But when I was a kid, playing in the woods behind my house, of course, all us Gen Xers would just play until it got dark out, and then you'd hear your mom yell and you'd come running back, or you'd get grounded for a month, whatever it was. But I would get lost in those woods, and there used to be like a horse crematorium that was this really weird building in the middle of the woods, out in the middle of nowhere. And all these pottery shards I would find, and I just assumed that I was going to be Indiana Jones when I was a kid. I wanted to be an archaeologist and wear a felt hat and have a whip and be able to find cool stuff. And then I realized, I looked up what archaeologists do for a living, and I'm like, oh, that's a lot of desk work. I don't want to do that at all. But uncovering these shards and then trying to piece them back together. And then I remember one day specifically finding all these porcelain shards, and I found about 3 shards that fit back together perfectly, and they made a curve. And there was a story there, right? So there's this story. So it was some probably tin glazed earthenware with cobalt decoration on it, probably, Delft or something like that. I really wish I still had those shards, but I brought them home and put them in a felt Crown Royal bag that my dad gave me for all of my collections. I don't know why he had so many empty Crown Royal bags, but I would dump out those shards and all these little bones and little fragments of things I would find everywhere. And I'm like, these objects have a story to them. And whatever I make in ceramics, I still think about those shards. And I'm like, I don't want to have enough of an ego to think that I'm going to define our culture 1,000 years from now based on a pot someone's going to dig up from my backyard. But, you get a piece in a museum, you're like, well, how long is that museum going to last? Because I know my ceramics will outlast the museum. And it's interesting to think that way. It's like the narrative is not going to stop. Eventually, it all gets pulverized and turned back into sand, which is where ceramics starts from anyway. So I kind of love that whole cycle of life thing that happens. But there's a staying power to ceramics that I never felt I could get from painting, printmaking, all the things that I did two-dimensionally, which I still enjoy doing, but there was limitations to this idea that I could say something and have some sort of say in my kids' lives after I'm gone, or their kids' lives, and what stories can you tell? And I think that's kind of where I landed on that. I love the idea of a fired surface just having that archival quality that you can't get from just about anything else.
Yeah, I've got 2 thoughts in my head right now. One is the political pieces that you did. It was almost like a small series, which was really, really interesting, because I'm trying to think back in time and space, art history. I don't think I ever remembered an artist, and I'm not talking about a ceramics factory that produces dinnerware and everything else, who came out with commemorative plates or plates. Well, for example, in another part of my family, from England, Staffordshire, one sister worked in the ROF, the Royal Ordnance Factory, and the other sister worked in a pottery, one of the many potteries that they had. And one of the things that they made during the war was a thunder mug. People call them bedpans, but that's not a correct term. It's basically just giant-sized mug. If you can imagine, it looks like it holds a gallon of coffee.
Yes.
You'd slide under the bed, and then there was no indoor plumbing, or you didn't want to go out into the freezing night. That's where you went. And so what they did is they had the face of Adolf Hitler on the very bottom of it.
Right. Yeah. The subversive ceramics of World War II. Yeah.
Exactly.
And one for that matter.
Yeah. But again, that's not from an individual artist or artisan's perspective. So Could you tell us about that particular? It was in the Wise Guy shows, and I remember
Yes,
it was
yeah.
really, it was really like whoa, ho, ho, ho. You know,
Yeah.
yeah.
I tried. Oh God, so my dad's a incredibly well known and respected award winning photographer, portrait photographer, an amazing educator as well, and he always talked about don't get into religion, don't get into politics. If you're going to work for yourself and you're going to be an artist and you want to make a living at it, you've got to keep these things to yourself. Be Switzerland at all times. And I did my best. I really did for a long time to kind of stay out of it. Or if I did get political, I tried to keep those things within the realm of an easy conversation with someone that would question it, because it used to be okay to have civil discourse. And now that we're so polarized, it's kind of like, well, if you're going to shout from the rooftops with your insanity, then so will I, to some degree. So that particular piece, though, the American Museum of Ceramics in California, in Pomona, California, had asked myself and a handful of ceramic artists from around the country, after Donald Trump was elected, to respond to the current political climate and make some pieces to send to the museum for this show called We the People. And that's the piece that I made. And at that time, nothing that was on the plate had happened yet. And all of it ended up happening. So it was really, it was really mind-numbing when, as things were unfolding, I started, that plate ended up in a box when they shipped it back to me. They didn't necessarily catch a lot of heat, but a lot of the reviews were very polarized, and it probably gave us more heat than any one of us as artists in that show wanted at the time. But it was really, I looked a lot at the Russian revolutionary porcelain from World War I era, beautifully done, and incredibly dangerous for those artists to be making those, right? So I didn't want to necessarily be dangerous. I had 2 young kids, and when I was trying to figure out what to do for that particular show, my daughter had woken up and had asked me about Donald Trump if he had won, because she had voted in an election in kindergarten, and she had, wanted me to know that she did not vote for him. And I'm like, oh, well, no, honey, I'm sorry to tell you that, he did win. And she says, well, Daddy, why did the bad man win? And whatever who's listening to this, sorry, I'm trying not to be polarizing. Whatever your political beliefs are, I had taken my stand. I've been a diehard liberal my whole life. And my daughters were kind of witnessing that without me realizing it. And that statement is what that piece is called. It's called Daddy, Why Did the Bad Man Win? And I asked one of my Russian students at the Art Center in Falmouth, where I teach, who's from Siberia, and is an amazing scientist. I asked her to correctly spell out the bad man, and it ends up being one word. And I'm like, oh, that's perfect. That's going to go at the bottom of the plate. No one other than someone who speaks Russian is going to be able to understand it. But when it went to the Wise Guys show, what was really amazing to me, when we were setting the show up, I had hung that up on the wall. And if you remember, it was right on the wall as you walked out of the elevator. And I was like, oh boy, Dawn wanted me to hang it there. And I'm like, eesh, all right, that's quite the entrance coming into that show. But I kind of loved it at the same time. And the janitor had come in with a ladder, had put the ladder back somewhere in the theater area, and was coming out and kind of sweeping up and moved the table. And as he was leaving, he walked up to the plate and he looks at it a couple times, and he turns around and he walks towards the elevator, and he raises his fist up in the air and he goes, "Let's go, Trump." And he gets in the elevator and he goes down, and I sat there stunned, because I didn't know if he thought that I was in his corner and supporting him, or he wasn't getting the message, or was he getting the message to the point where it was like, well, screw you, he's in office and whatever. And that's the power of the work, right? I think the things that we say, the things that we put down on paper, the things we put on our pots, it's all open to interpretation. We don't get to tell people what to think, I guess. I thought it was pretty clear myself.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's the beholder does hold that sway. You know, I've mentioned Ernst Gombrich, you know, from Art and Illusion, you know, many times, almost every show, and he said that it's so important. And since I can't resist the pun, you really had a lot on your plate.
Yes, there was.
Okay, now a more serious thing I've been wanting to ask you from the beginning. I had a friend, and he was a potter. He did this, you know, absolutely gorgeous redware and stoneware. He grew up in that tradition, but he felt that there's something missing in his life. So his vocation was as a potter. And then he got the calling, and he became a Jesuit brother.
Wow.
But the Jesuits, they have a dark history, but they also have a very enlightened history. It's very, very interesting history, depending on where on the timeline they are. And he was told he didn't have to give up his pottery. So his vocation became his advocation, and he thought, in other words, it flipped around. But this idea of building pots was very spiritual to him, because, you know, from Genesis, you know, from building, making human beings, making something
born of clay,
born of clay in the mud, you know, is such an important factor. And then, you know, I'm jumping over to the funerary jars of Egypt. Now, you know, they were both functional. I mean, they had, you know, one had to hold, you know, each one for a specific organ. They didn't save the brain because they didn't think it was worth anything. But anyway,
they were right.
They were right, yeah. But, you know, they had these funerary jars. And so not only were they functional to preserve these organs, but they were absolutely beautiful. And so the description on the jar not only described what was inside the jar, but what was inside the person, or what made up the person, you know. So it's still an amazing art, especially in this day and age, where the more we go into the digital age, the less we depend or have the skill set, or taught the skill set, or we seek to find out how to create these kinds of things. But then at the same time, the arts and crafts movement was born out of the Industrial Revolution, because people were just sick and tired of mass-produced garbage.
Right.
They wanted something that had value to it.
Sure.
What are your thoughts of ceramics in the 21st century?
I'm always floored by what I do has this profound staying power, because it's 27,000 years old. The first ceramic object, you know, is from that incredible amount of time. That kind of staying power is not something that you dial up very easily. So when something like 3D printing in clay comes along and you feel that seismic shift, you start to worry. You're like, oh my God, you know, is AI going to put me out of a job too? Like, I can understand why it's going to put so-and-so out of a job and so-and-so else and everything else, because that's the cycle of life in the arts. But I've seen nothing but innovation because of the excitement of something that has never existed in our art form that is now at our disposal to play with. And so, when that first came out, my mentor and teacher in college, Chris Gustin, he had the opportunity to be doing this workshop with a bunch of other wonderful potters. And he had this opportunity to 3D print. They were going to scan his larger vessels and then 3D print them in a smaller size and out of clay. And then he wanted to bring them back to his wood kiln and fire them in the wood kiln. Very daring thing to do. But he didn't, as per usual, he didn't just do that. He said, well, I don't know exactly how it went down, but he asked at this woman who was a curator at the Fuller at the time, who was an incredible vocalist, to sing into one of his large pots. They recorded the sound waves of her tone, and they 3D printed the exact replica of the pot from her sound waves in clay. I'm still blown away by that idea. And that's just scratching the surface of what we have available to us. Now we're 3D printing homes in third world countries out of clay because that's the material they have. So here we go again with clay being that kind of consistent, constant material that every culture that never would have met each other, or maybe they did, maybe they didn't, pre-land bridge, land bridge, this material has always found its way to assist human beings in survival. And the beauty of it is wonderful. The art of it is wonderful. Like you said, it was the first biography before we printed it, right? These vessels telling the stories of kings and queens and all these, amazing things. It still frightens me that we're losing our sense of touch. It worries me when I have young potters show up at the middle school and high school that I teach at on the Cape, and they say, "Oh yeah, I've made pots before." I'm like, "Oh yeah, where? How? Who? Who'd you study with? Whatever." And they're like, "Oh no, there's an app." I'm like, "No, there is not. But the app's pretty amazing." Now I'm like, "Well, that's not touching." But what it did do is the second they sat down to learn from me, they understood the physics of a spinning object. And they were immediately better at it than if I had taught them and they had never experienced that app. So here was another example where I was eating crow and saying, well, I don't like the fact that they actually thought that they threw something when they actually hadn't touched anything. But once they did, they immediately skipped over probably 3 months worth of learning that I had to do in college when I took ceramics. So that's pretty amazing. It's like, there are certain levels of the information out there that is a hindrance. I think people look, and I'm certainly guilty of it, they'll scroll through Instagram at all these potters and they'll see a 30-second video of them making something. They go into the studio and they waste 50 pounds of clay trying it because they're not remotely ready to do it. Mm-hmm. But you know what? They went in with this incredible attitude that they somehow could. And then, of course, I have to place all the Band-Aids and say, no, let's start from here. So this century of ceramics has gone through immense change, just like all other art forms. But somehow clay is always winning, right? So I think that material is winning. I can't say that for every art form. And it certainly makes me sad when I see ceramics programs closing all over the country. But at the same time, as they're closing, you're seeing more and more amazing adult education art centers popping up everywhere. And you're seeing way more programs for kids popping up everywhere. Middles of cities, countrysides, all these incredible cultures are bringing the idea of the handmade object as a way of getting off their devices. And I find that funny because they're trying to find inspiration from their devices to go to these classes. So I don't think we're losing that battle. I think the landscape of education is changing dramatically, and that makes me sad. But I think the information is getting out there in a way that if we can push the right buttons, we're going to have an amazing crop of talent coming out in the next 100 years. It's interesting to see.
Yeah, when you mentioned the app and then how they jumped right into it, all I could think of was the Karate Kid, wax on, wax off. It's imprinting.
Yeah. Right.
And they've got the process imprinted in their heads. And and in the case of the Karate Kid, obviously it was for karate, but in the case of the pottery, it's almost the exact same thing. Of course, you could take Mr. Miyagi's lessons and apply that to ceramics as well, because it is about touch. When you were talking about your blind students, all I could think of was they had eyes on their fingertips. They have a tactile experience that is quite unlike a sighted person. And I can't say that from experience, only from having known sightless people.
Sure.
or sight challenged, visually challenged people. And then you're talking about, these programs are closing down. Even at our own alma mater, one of the retired professors I bumped into said, when you were there was 11 sections of drawing, not to 2.
Yep. Right.
And in some cases, in some programs, they're cutting out drawing. Where would foundation be without drawing? The foundation, the foundation of foundation was drawing.
Well, but Ron, think about this, because someone just said this to me the other day, and I was like, wow, I didn't think of it that way. Because the foundation's changing. Right?
It's true.
So I don't think we have a choice in, I jokingly, because I'm turning 50 this year, and it's hitting me like a freight train. But I keep saying I'm gonna crush my 50s. I'm ready. But I don't want to be that get off my lawn guy, right? So I don't want to pine for the good old days. I mean, when I was at UMass Dartmouth, yeah, you're right. The ceramics department was right behind Glazer Glass on the bottom floor of Purchase Street.
Yeah.
The back door never locked. At one point I had a homeless guy sleeping in my studio space, and I got him a coffee, and he made sure that, like, in the winter, that my car was shoveled out. I mean, it was like this kind of amazing
symbiotic relationship.
It was nuts. It was just strange and bizarre and freeing. 24-hour access. I slept there more than I stayed at my apartment half the time. But therein lies the changes, structure, and time, right? So the foundation's just changing. You can't just move a house to a new foundation and expect it to fit. I think you have to create a new foundation for a new house. And I think that's what art as a whole is having to go through right now.
Yeah, and there's one thing too, the word vigil popped into my head. I mean, the homeless guy was no fool. He knows, hey, that kiln is warm, 24/7. What a great place to hang out. As long as the guy doesn't scream at me and tell me to go away, he had a warm place to stay, a dry place to stay, and all that. But somebody has to watch the kilns. There's a vigil, there's a watch,
Right.
So that goes back to almost a primal thing of fire, that we didn't talk about fire. But the other thing, when you talk about the foundational shift, you actually precluded it by saying, because they're dropping these programs from traditional collegiate education to more of a grassroots community level, it's absolutely almost done a complete flip around. I've heard of people who are saying that we are probably going to be seeing something similar to the old guild system come back, where instead of going to a college or a university, you're going to find the best potter in town, the best weaver, the best printmaker or whatever, and say, hey, my kids, wants to do this. We don't have the money, or I don't want to spend the money on it, but I don't want to disappoint him either. Do you need an assistant here?
Yeah.
And it goes beyond sweeping the floors and going out for coffee and all those other things, because you are in that environment.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it really is a hands-on experience that makes this huge difference in people's lives. There's also something really interesting happening too, that
at least in ceramics, is happening that I'm witnessing and hearing from colleagues that are in the same age group as I am, because as they're losing their adjunct jobs because these programs are drying up, they're going to art centers and craft centers throughout the country that have adequate, if not better, studios than the colleges they just came from. They're amazed at the level of excitement and determination by the student population. And that student population isn't 70-year-old women as everyone expects it to be. I teach on the Cape where, when I got the job, I was like, oh man, this is going to be all retirees and I don't know about this. And then I realized that, all my student population were primarily 30 something, sometimes late 20 somethings that were Woods Hole oceanographic scientists, worked at Hui, and they wanted to know the chemistry of everything. They wanted to understand why. They asked me why more than I did as a kid, and I was super annoying as a kid and asking why about everything. I would put those students up against any I've taught, whether it's college level or high school level, anything, against any of them in terms of their ability to adapt, to ask really pertinent questions. It's fascinating. It's really fascinating because now you get teachers like myself that are ending up at art centers and whatnot and not doing the adjunct, hokey pokey, that are getting paid adequately and dealing with the student population that is not paying for a grade or a piece of paper. They're quite literally going because they desperately want to learn what I do and they want to be good at it. And some of them have turned into amazing potters that are now making a living doing it. Some of my beginning students from 6 years ago are now teaching classes for me. I mean, that's a huge shift from when I was teaching at art centers, 25 years ago. When I first started teaching in Phoenix, those students were amazing too. But it was like you had the retirees in the afternoon and then you had those that worked coming at night. And now that has shifted dramatically because you have a lot of people working from home. You have a lot of people that are working jobs that they work 30 hours and they work 3 days a week and they have the rest of the week off. So we're not getting just one population ever. So you get all this kind of amazing amalgamation of experience, talent, drive coming together to really want to learn to do something well. It's really pretty impressive to me.
It is. There are a lot of people, from what I know of the Detroit Fine Arts Breakfast Club, there have been these, they refer to them as latent lifers and so on and so forth. People who had, excellent careers, but in their heart of hearts, they have always wanted to do something that, and I keep going back to my wife's query from a while back. Do you want to be sustained or do you want to be supported by your art? And these people, they rented their bodies, on an hourly basis to provide a service to somebody else that's making much more money than they are, or if they've leased out their themselves to just put food on a table, pay the mortgage, so on and so forth. And the important thing has been always in that background. I remember my first community art class was a very emotional experience. There were people there. It was almost like an art therapy course. There were people there who had been damaged by an adult and told, put that away. That's childish things. You'll never make any money. I mean, all this negativity. And they were in that class to see who was right.
Right.
And that was, as an instructor, you want to deliver the instruction, you want to deliver the lesson. But then when you have this other dynamic on top, it's like, whoa. I always call them, birds with broken wings. How do I mend those wings so they can fly again? And now I've also noticed a shift, and I could be wrong, but I was in marketing for a long time, and some of the stuff is almost like intuitive. And this has also become somewhat of a challenge for a practicing artist, especially a former abstractionist, that people looked at abstract work and it used to be like, oh, I don't understand that. I have to go to school for that, blah, 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 all these other things. Then it shifted to, oh, that's so much fun. So now it was some sort of therapy.
Sure.
That they're performing on themselves, and the market is flooded with this fun abstract stuff.
Right.
And then you don't want to be a snob and say, hey, is the same thing happening in ceramics?
I'm going to be light.
Go ahead, go for it.
On this one.
Yeah.
There's always going to be people that are going to make schlock. You know, the joke on the cape. Right, exactly. The joke on the cape is that if you make it blue and put, a starfish or a shell on something, it'll sell. But it's not a joke. It's just flat out true. Right. When I lived in Arizona, it was make something red or put a cocopelli on it. And that was true. Right. I would rather have that be the first touch to a new collector that got dragged there by their mom or whatever, that bought that handmade piece, because I can give them a 3-minute quick little, hey, thanks so much. Did you realize that there's only one of these that's ever going to be made on this planet because my hands touched it and it'll never be reproduced again? Mm-hmm. No. Mm-hmm. And then you build that magic, and, selling is something that I enjoy doing. And I think it's my responsibility in the marketplace and in the world of ceramics. And I've always tried to harness that energy, is to help the creative economy understand that you have value. And every student you run into, every person at a craft sale, that is going to say, well, do you have one of these in blue? Because my couch is blue. When you've heard that for 40 years and you have arthritis and a hunchback because you've been throwing 100 pots a day for 40 years, I can understand that going straight up a keister. But in my case, I look at that and say, I get the opportunity to flip this. I don't want to be told no. And I don't think this person wants to be told no either. So if I reinforce that they made a good purchase, and I can't wait to see what they choose next from another studio potter, I can't tell you how many times I've flipped people from buying, you see someone a year later, they come to the same sale because that's the only one they ever go to in a given year. And they'll say, oh God, you were so right. When I got home, I threw out every single World's Best Mom mug that I got from a store because they're so uncomfortable. You told me about that handle and you're absolutely right. And now I've bought 6 mugs from different potters from all over the place. And I'm like, all right, I didn't get a commission on any of those, but that's job security, right?
You have an evangelist now.
We need people to be advocates. And I consider myself to be one of those on such a small scale. But, sure, there's going to be plenty of people that make stuff that you're like, oh, God, please no. And then you're going to get surprised by people that on day 1 or day 3 or whatever else, you're going to be like, they're not getting this. They're terrifyingly bad. Their choice of colors, obnoxious, all of these things that we think about as educators and whatnot. And then they just hit a stride out of nowhere and they make this amazing stuff and they start showing. Next thing you know, they're buying a wheel, they're getting a kiln at home, they develop a studio, they have a second career, a second income stream, they get to travel, they go do workshops and meet people they've never met before. It's a beautiful thing. How hard is that? Yeah. Or do we just want to not sell anything and be snobs about what we do? I can be a snob about what I do.
It is very easy to go that, because you think it's basically armor. You're just trying to protect yourself. But I've several times I've gone back to Jay Peterman. And especially with the younger generation, I always say Jay Peterman. And now because time is gone, that younger generation has no idea what I'm talking about. So it's like that middle generation.
Sure.
Gen Y, Z, whatever it is. The old Seinfeld show, one of the characters, Elaine's boss, was J. Peterman.
Yep.
He was a real guy, the J. Peterman catalog. And part of his manifesto, one of the paragraphs or lines in his manifesto was, when will American business realize that people want things that make their lives the way they wish they were?
Sounds simple to me, right?
It is. And I think, when somebody buys your pot, it's, or, your mug, your plate, or, whether it has a political affectation, whether it's utilitarian, whether it's not, they are looking for that uniqueness. I think people are, that's why people dress the way they do. I mean, I remember being at SMU and it was May Day, and that was, believe it or not, free chicken and beer on campus, and having to go to the bathroom in the library restroom, and coming out and trying to remember where my friends were. And it hit me. We were that generation that we were individualists. We weren't going to let the man tell us what to do. And all I could see on the quad was a sea of blue jeans.
Yeah.
I mean, it was homogenous. It was absolutely homogenous. So we're going to start winding down.
Sure.
What's in your plans? What's the next thing? What's the thing that's been, you woke up in the middle of the night going, whoa, where did that come from? And then you've been wanting to get to, but you have all these other things as usual. Oh, I got this commitment, I got that commission, I got this and that, and you want to get to that thing. Do you have a thing?
Well, so it's actually a great question, because I was just saying to my girlfriend the other day how the ceramics world, the art world in general, after the pandemic, took a really long time to kind of kick back in terms of sales, in terms of events, all of those things. Half the galleries I was working with either closed or just said, give us time. So this past year, and actually it was the Wise Guys show that was like the first full show that I felt really compelled to want to be at, to do good work for, et cetera, because nothing was happening. And since that show, things have kind of blown up again. And I'm like, okay, this isn't getting back to normal. This is a new engine. There's something new about this, and I like it. And I don't want it to move faster than I'm capable of moving. So to be honest with you, what I've been kind of losing sleep over in a good way is really starting to finish some of these long-winded narratives that have been rattling around in my head as longer series of larger pieces, wanting to get to those. But really, I want to hold back, which is hard for me to do because, of course, I want to sell everything I make, and I tend to have the good fortune of doing so. I want to hold back the best of those pieces over the next 6 weeks, whatever it may be, because I'm finally relaunching a website, because right now everyone's killing it with their online stores because they're driving sales through Instagram and everything else. And I'm like, I don't want to not be part of that revolution. I don't have a brick and mortar gallery anymore. I enjoyed having one, but not having to pay huge rents and overhead and be there 70 hours a week and just go home and shoot photos and put them up on my website and sell them for 100% of the profit sounds great to me. So that's really what's most exciting to me right now. And so, of course, the idea of branding and all that wonderful stuff. So I'm kind of absorbed in that. I've got shows coming up, kind of all over the place, but that's kind of the normalcy of getting back to things, preparing for shows, not doing as much traveling as I'd like to, but focusing on my kids as I always do, and they inspire the heck out of me. So just spending moments with them, and yeah, all of that. It's kind of just good to get back to seeing people again and doing events, going to openings. That's it.
Yeah,
living the good life.
I mean, I just saw somebody today coming back from the Fairhaven Cultural Council, and then we realized, wow, this is the first time we've seen each other in person in how long? I mean, because the pandemic,
sure,
and all these other things. And the pandemic was, it was a giver and a taker. For some people who never had a gallery, they were selling work unsolicited. And they were like, drop jaw, is this a scam? Is this, and they were doing very well. I didn't do badly either, but now it's shriveled up for me. Whereas the people who had galleries and weren't selling anything at all, they're just getting back into that groove of things.
Correct.
So there's still this, and speaking of the word correct, there is a correction that is still going on.
Correct. Yeah.
That is going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. And I'm also interested to find out, I mean, because especially with my wife's family and friends in Detroit, people find out, oh, he lives in Portugal, and I was like, yeah. And I remember when I was living there, they, people, you get to know them and they start to loosen up enough to be able to ask you questions that are important to them. It's like, did you come here because of Trump? It's like, no, I made up my mind to come here before. I mean, I didn't even think that was a possibility.
Sure.
And it's a life change, and I'm not impulsive, but in this particular case, I figured, hey, what the heck? And so here I am. So now family and friends in Detroit, every time we see it's like, so how was it, expatriating and what's happened? There's been this incredible groundswell of people. I'd like to find out what the stats are on visas, because, they got people who want to come into this country, okay, which is a whole other ugly thing to talk about, and probably would be a great setting for an exhibit. But there's also a lot of people here who have just had it and they want to go away. They want a place where they can walk to wherever, whether they're buying bread, produce, fish, meat, whatever. They don't want any more of this BS. They feel like they've been sold a bill of goods on the American dream, was really all Madison Avenue hype. There is no such thing.
Sure.
So, and at the same time, they're divesting themselves of all this, of a garage that's so full that they can't put their car in there, which was the purpose of the garage.
They have. I thought it was for studios.
They have a china cabinet full of china that they, used to have for special, right?
Right.
That they don't bother anymore. So they're finding their lives are like, why are we doing this? Why do we need this big house to have all this stuff that we never ever use?
Right.
And so I'm thinking that perhaps with ceramics, that you might be on the leading edge of this adjustment in the art marketplace, because you're buying something that has a utilitarian background. It's a piece of art. It's unique, but you don't have to worry about it matching your drapes or hanging over the couch, or, and it's affordable. It's affordable. I don't know. I'm just kind of curious to see where it's all going, because, I spent a long time in marketing begrudgingly, but even after being out of it now for 13 years, it's hard to shut that.
Oh yeah. The analytics
and
right.
The old thing that, you go to art school and they teach you how to solve problems is an old axe. Adrian Teo said, no. We teach you to see patterns, recognize patterns, and follow through on those patterns. So, wow, this has been great. We have to get together. I mean, our incredibly busy lives and crazy schedules and stuff, but we definitely have to get together. And hopefully the next time it'll be at the Play Arcade, which poor Adam Katz.
I can't even believe it. I know.
From a little tiny leak to, oh my God.
I know. Well, at least he has the building skills to hopefully, get the money he needs and build it quick. In
a weird way, it may be a blessing in disguise, because, it's always, it's the little Dutch boy that kept his finger in a dike. It was just a simple thing,
Matter of time.
Yeah. Any final or parting thoughts?
It's funny this is my first podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So that was interesting. And I realized that I've only really started listening to podcasts maybe about 4 years ago. And it made me feel really old that there's all this content out there. And I thought about the archival ideas of ceramics and how somehow digitally, whatever we're talking about today will be archived in a way that maybe my kids or my grandkids or my great grandkids will have access to someday. And that kind of floors me. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome. Cool. The New Bedford Whaling Museum is a collaborator with us, and they're digitizing everything and putting it into their database. And there's a whole other story there. I mean, they've gone from, the Whaling Museum that we all went to on the 4th grade field trip, and I guess somebody must have did some research, because like, when was the last time you went to the Whaling Museum on a 4th grade field trip? Why didn't you ever come back? For what? I saw it all.
Right.
But they are really,
Not
really
anymore.
No, they're really getting out there. Really getting out there. Thank you so much, Seth. I really, really appreciate this. And folks, we've been speaking with Seth Rainville, ceramicist, ceramics artist, ceramics artisan, pot thrower extraordinaire. And if you haven't seen his work, click the link on the blog page that accompanies this episode, and feast your eyes on something that's truly, truly unique. And with that, remember, just be nice to each other out there. Bye-bye.
We'll see you next week for another episode of the South Coast Artist Index podcast. To learn more about the South Coast Artist Index, visit theartistindex.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube.